Well, hi, my name is Greg and you're watching chapter 20 of my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. Well, as you may guess, at chapter 20 this has been a long-running story. In this chapter I'm going to cover quite a bit of work. I'm going to cover work that I did in the total rewiring of this car. So this video will cover work that I did in fitting a new wiring loom, as well as quite a bit of extra wiring that wasn't included in the wiring loom. I'll cover work that I did in fitting a power isolation switch so that I could isolate the battery power during periods when I'm not using the car regularly, which would probably be most of the time. I'll also cover work that I did in fitting flashing indicators. So this car didn't have any flashing indicators when I bought it. I've also retained the original trafficators. So this video will cover work that I did in refurbishing those. So quite a bit of work covered overall. Subsequently this video will probably be a little bit longer than what I usually do, but it does cover some interesting stuff, so hang in there and I hope to see you throughout the video. So here's the original wiring loom removed from my car. So it was removed whilst the car was at the body repair workshop when we got to the stage of having to remove the body from the chassis to continue the rust repairs. As you can see, it's in pretty poor condition. A lot of problems with it really. I think there are quite a few modifications made from it from original. I didn't find it all that useful as a reference point when I came to fit my new wiring loom for a couple of reasons really. One, it was already removed, so I couldn't sort of determine how the wires were sort of laid out and organised in the car. But the second big problem I had is if you look at it closely, the original colour coding was largely faded to the point of being fairly unrecognisable. I am reminded of an 80s song called Fade to Grey, but well, it's not grey, but you get what I mean. I originally had plans for a body-on restoration, but best laid plans and all that. It turned out that the car had a lot more rust in it than I anticipated, so we ended up removing the body, and it was at this point that we removed the old wiring system as well. Lots and lots of photos taken during this disassembly stage of the wiring system, which I originally thought would be pretty helpful. They were a little bit helpful, but not as much as I thought, largely because the colour coding had deteriorated so much. However, they were helpful in just determining the overall layout of the wiring system. Well, I started off the rather daunting task of this rewiring project with this heavy-duty cable which connects the battery that sits under the seat to the starter motor solenoid in the engine bay. So quite early in the project I decided I was going to replace the wiring, so I ordered a new wiring loom from AutoSparks in the UK, which turned out to be a pretty smooth process. So you just get onto their website, specify your make and model of car, year, whether you want extra wiring for indicators, whether you want extra wiring for a radio and so on and so forth. And then in my case, 3 months later it turned up, and yeah, very happy with it. Well, next I'll cover some of the early sort of preparation work I did as I was beginning to do the rewiring on my car. So I'll cover the wire stripping and the tinning of the wires, which I think was pretty important. So that's next up. Next thing I'll show is wire stripping. I would have liked to have used a wire stripper like this, where you just lay the wire across like so, and done, or almost done. Your wire stripped. These work really well on sort of modern plastic coated insulation, but they don't work so well on the wiring on a P3 Rover, which has, and I've got a small sample of the original wiring here. So the original wiring has fabric insulation as well, and if you try and use a wire stripper on that, let's see what happens. Yeah, it takes off the fabric well enough. Maybe you can get it on a second go. No, it doesn't work so well. So what I found I had to do was to use a wire stripper more like this, which has different diameter holes there for different gauges of wire, and what I would do is find the right diameter, and then you'd have to go around several times sort of rotating the wire to ensure that you cut through all the fabric. I haven't really done a very good job here, but you get the general idea. So yeah, find the right size hole, and then you have to go around several times, and then often you have to sort of prise off the insulation with your fingernails. So a fairly laborious process. Well, the next job after all that stripping, which took quite a while because there's really quite a lot of ends of wire to strip in the whole wiring system, is the tinning of the wires. So the tinning involves just putting a little bit of solder on each of the ends of the wire, which just holds the strands of wire together and stops fraying. So I'll cover that next. So I did my tinning like this, which is really a technique that I learned off of YouTube. So I've just really got this set up for demonstration purposes, and I'm using a gas-powered soldering iron because it's just more convenient for what I'm doing here now. So the first step of the process is get the iron hot, put a little bit of solder on the tip of your iron, which will aid for heat transfer. You touch that on your wire like so, and keep that fairly firmly on there, and then using basically a capillary action, I'm not sure how well you'll see that, but that just flows on there nicely, and that's really all you have to do. The temptation is to put more solder on than that, which is a mistake that I made quite frequently in the early days, but it is a mistake. It's what you end up with is a tip of the wire that's too thick to fit into many of your connectors, and then you have to sort of wipe some of the solder off later on. So that's how I went about it. What I did find very helpful for rewiring my car was this workshop manual, which is produced by the Rover Sports Register in England. Towards the back of the manual there's a wiring diagram. I've enlarged the size of the wiring diagram here so that I can see it. Hopefully you can see it as well. So as you see, as I go through the diagram here, all the main sort of component parts of the electrical system are there, and it shows the ordering of the wiring. I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to see it, but if you look at each wire, there's a number. So for example here, number 57. If you come over here, number 25, number 9. And then as you go towards the bottom of this diagram, you can see the colours are identified. So number 1, for example, is blue, and number 2, blue-red, and so on and so forth. So this was really, really helpful. I don't know how I would have done the job without it. Well, the next job is determining where on earth do you start, and it did take me a while to figure a good answer to that question. In the end, I resolved to start at the regulator, and I'll explain why in a minute. Unfortunately, I didn't film a lot of the initial wiring installation, so I'm going to have to explain it. So after identifying the wiring that goes to the regulator, I laid the whole wiring loom out on a bench and then began to label it. But it was very important to have that regulator wiring identified first, because from that sort of starting or reference point, you can begin to identify the rest of the wiring. So here we are out with the car. So I'm just going to go over to where the regulator is. So here is the regulator. So as you can see, there is quite a distinctive group of wires which connect to the regulator. So within the context of the whole wiring loom, it's not too difficult to identify this group of wires. There's really nothing else like it on the wiring loom. So once this is identified, it really helps you with a lot of other things. Now, going through the bulkhead here, you can see there's a thick branch of wires here, and the same on the other side. On the driver's side is another thick group of wires, not as thick as this side, by the way. But once you've identified this regulator group of wires, it's pretty easy to determine that this thick group of wires comes through on the passenger side, because it's closest to the regulator group of wires. Also, once you've identified this thick group of wires, the wires that taper off from it, such as the wires I'm showing you now, it's easy to identify this group of wires which are threaded through. I don't know how well you're going to see it, but there are little clips down there where this group of wires connects to. And I haven't completed the wiring here yet, but I have done some of the labelling. So if you look at my labelling, there's wires for the horns, there's wires for the parking lights, and the wires for the headlights which connect via this junction box, and you have wires which go through to the fog light and the horn, or the horn on this side. I'll move over to the other side now. But before I do that, I'll just show some still shots that I took when I was threading the wires through the bulkhead in the early stages of the rewiring process. Most of the wires that you see here connect to the gauges and switches on the dashboard. So on the other side now, so here's that other thick group of wires which I was talking about, which comes through the bulkhead. As you can see, not as thick. And again, once you've identified that comes through there, there are earth wires that connect here, so it's fairly clear that's where they go. There are wires which will go to your fuel pump, and it's fairly clear where they branch off. And again, there's this long group of wires which is very similar to the other side. You've got wires that go to the side light and to the junction box down there, and the horn on this side. Also in this group of wires which come through here on the driver's side, I'm not sure how well you're going to see it. I'm going to point down there. So this wires track down here alongside the fuel pump, and it's going to be very hard to show you, but they track right down there on the underside of the bulkhead. So those wires which go underneath the bulkhead then track along just underneath this floorboard here, and then they attach via some little brackets to a chassis member, and they track way back. They keep on going back. There's an earth connection sort of fairly near the battery, and then there's a branch of wires that goes over the fuel tank. We'll go to the back now. Here we are looking in the boot. They go over the fuel tank, and then there's another sub branch of wires which connect to a couple of things on the fuel tank. So you've got your fuel reserve valve there, and also a sender unit which sends a signal to your fuel gauge. And then there are sub branches of wires which come to things like your rear lights, indicator lights, and then the lights for the rear number plate. Here's a shot inside the rear guard on the passenger side, just showing the wiring to that rear light. I've been pretty careful with how I went about it, so I've used a bit of heat shrink on the ends of the wires, P-clips, cable ties, and just try to keep things pretty neat and tidy. This is the rear number plate mount showing the original illumination lights, which are all in pretty poor condition. I opted just to get some reproduction lights because it was just a better way to go, really. It wouldn't have been cost effective to fix these up. Just connecting up the number plate lights here after I had the mounting plate powder coated. The rear lights on my car were in pretty terrible condition with the lenses on both sides cracked. I managed to find some refurbished ones with new lenses on eBay, so I went for that. They are slightly different from mine, in that mine are painted red inside, whereas the ones I got from eBay have a clear lens. Next I'm going to cover some work that I did in fitting a power isolation switch to my car, which is really an addition to the wiring loom. I wanted to have this feature because I don't envisage that I'm going to be using my car on a regular basis. So having the ability to have the power disconnected from the battery during times when it's not in use would be a good feature to have. Well, the plan today is to work out a way of mounting this power cut-off switch. So this will isolate the battery power. So I bought this rather nice quality switch from a supplier in the UK. So I just got to figure out a way of mounting it. So after a bit of thought, I've figured I'll mount it on the firewall. I'll show you the spot in a minute, and I'll use some Delrin that I've found out of my stock here. So I'll probably use a piece of this, and I'll go through how I'm going to make that work now. So here you can see the isolation switch fitted. I mounted it to a pre-existing blanking plate, and that blanking plate's there. It blocks off a hole where the steering column would go if the car was a left-hand drive car. Well, that was fun. I really quite enjoyed mucking around with that. Next up, I'm going to cover work that I did on refurbishing the trafficators on my car. Now with my new wiring loom, I've got extra wiring for flashing indicators, which I'll require for using the car in the present day. But I also want to retain the original trafficators because I think it's a nice touch. So here's one of the trafficators out of the car. They look pretty grubby, but they cleaned up pretty well in the end. I did quite a bit of work in just cleaning up the trafficator mechanism generally. So I've just wire brushed all the outside sort of steel. I'll put a new insulator in there and a new insulator piece in here. Replace this wire, which was in pretty bad shape. But one of the interesting things I've done, I think, is so originally it has a so-called festoon bulb like that sits in underneath this chrome strip and sits about there inside. I've replaced that with a little LED. I guess you can't really call it a festoon bulb, but it's an LED light with a built-in circuit that makes it flash. So I'll just give a demonstration of that. So the power wire goes there, and the earth wire can go pretty much anywhere. Next up, I'm going to show some work that I did on the switchgear so that we can actually see these trafficators and flashing indicators working. I had the switchgear repainted in a two-pack finish because the original finish was in pretty poor condition. I just cleaned up the internals on this switch, and the wire that comes out of this switch isn't part of the wiring loom, so I had to sort of cut that myself and then wrap it in a cloth electrical tape, which is pretty much how it would have been originally, I think. So I'm just going to show you, or try to show you, how I wired up my indicator switches so that I'd have both the flashing indicators and the trafficators. So under the dash now, and as you can see, I've got two relay switches there. So with the wiring loom, there was wiring for the trafficators, color-coded for left and right. I had to have a separate relay switch for left and right. So these relay switches are really for supplying intermittent power to the flashing indicators. But because I had a LED bulb with its own built-in flashing unit on the trafficators, I didn't want the trafficators to go through this relay switch because if it did, what you'd have is a flashicator just basically popping up and down, which would be fairly useless and it'd wear itself out. So what I've done is the wiring that goes to the trafficators is just piggybacked off of here. So this wire is the wire that comes from the indicator switch, which when that indicator switch is turned on and the circuit completed, supplies power to here. So this is just piggybacked so that the power also goes to the appropriate trafficator switch. I hope that makes sense. So here we are with the car. I'm just going to show the indicators working, or as far as I'm able to this level of progression. So here's the trafficator working. At this stage I've only got the rear flashing indicator wired up. So here you are working, and go back to the trafficator. Hopefully you can see that okay. And back to the indicator. So I'm pretty happy with that. The only problem, well, it's not really a problem, is it's impossible to have the two synchronized really because they're operating off separate flasher circuits. And here's a close-up of that trafficator. I've still got a little bit of work to do in sort of lining up the doors so they're all shut properly, in case you're wondering. Well, next up I'm going to finish this video with just a very brief overview of some of the wiring work that I did behind the instrument panel. Well, this is where a fair bit of the wiring happens. So here's the back of the instrument panel. I've got it finished to my satisfaction now. Really, it's taken a fair while to get there. For the most part, the colour coding is worked well. For some reason, the wires that sort of link the panel lights are a different colour code to what's shown in the circuit diagram. But apart from that, everything was pretty much as expected. I'll just have a look deep in here. It's going to be a little bit hard to show you the details, but if I put my hand in the back here, you can see the wires that go to the indicator lights or to my indicator relay switches. So that's an addition I've made really to the wiring loom, but apart from that, it's pretty much unchanged really. Well, with this I'll wrap up chapter 20 of my 1949 P3 Rover restoration story. As always, I hope you found this chapter interesting and informative. I enjoyed making the video and enjoyed doing quite a lot of the work that was covered in this chapter, even though I have to say initially I was a bit reluctant to take on the job of rewiring the car, largely because it was well outside of my area of expertise. But I guess necessity is the mother of invention. I couldn't really afford to pay someone else to do it, so it's been an interesting learning experience. As for upcoming chapters, I'm going to largely focus on work that I've been doing recently, which will include work on refurbishing and refitting the sunroof, work that I did in putting new rubber mats on the running boards, refitting the front and rear windscreens, and just general reassembly work. So bye for now, and I hope to see you in my next video.